Listen, Carlito, ese. Beneath it all, there's always some unconscious sexual conflict. Perhaps, Ziggy, my friend. But what if the psyche is trying to become something? Become something? Yes. Something beyond the immediate demands of the instinct. Grüß Gott, Frau von Franz. Hey, Carlito, Ziggy, what's up, guys? Thanks so much for coming to my cave rave. Oh, by the way, if you want, there's some cheese and sheep sausage. The guy who lived in this cave before me made these huge sacks of cheese, and for some reason, he had a whole flock of sheep in here. Some of the cheese went moldy though, but it's actually quite tasty. So, you know, make yourselves at home. Ja, endlich, danke. How kind of you. Danke, Monolith. So, Freud. Obviously, Freud did not literally believe that every single thing in existence was about sex. Shh, ganz ruhig, Ziggy. Sorry, he gets a little rowdy during our sessions. But I think that ridiculous little conversation back at my cave rave illustrates a very real problem with Freud's psychology. Freud gave us an extraordinarily powerful lens through which to examine the human psyche. The problem begins when we mistake the lens for the thing itself. If you put on rose-colored glasses, the world starts looking rose-colored. That doesn't mean you've discovered that the world itself is rose-colored. It means you've adopted a particular way of seeing it. The things you see through those glasses may be perfectly real. The question is whether they're the whole picture. And I think this is where Freud was both profoundly right and profoundly wrong. Let's start with something Freud was absolutely right about. The conscious mind isn't the whole of the psyche. People don't always know why they do what they do. We repress things. We rationalize things. We act on motives we're not fully aware of. And Freud took this seriously in a way that was genuinely revolutionary. But then there is a second question. What exactly are we supposed to find when we look beneath consciousness? This is where Freud's framework can become enormously powerful and enormously restrictive. If you approach human behavior expecting to find repression, sexuality, aggression, infantile conflict, and unconscious desire, you're going to become very good at finding those things. But there's a danger. You can start interpreting everything in terms of the theory you're using to interpret it. It's the difference between saying, this theory reveals something interesting about the phenomenon, and saying, this phenomenon is fundamentally nothing but what my theory reveals. Nein, Karl, you are avoiding the obvious. Nein, Ziggy, ich vermeide gar nichts. Der Oedipus-Komplex ist nicht die ganze Geschichte. Of course, it is not the whole story, but it reveals the fundamental conflict. Ja, Ziggy, aber das Ding an sich is not necessarily what you think it is. Ach, Carlito, everything you do is turning psychology into mythology. And everything you see becomes sexuality. Because sexuality is important. Natürlich ist sie wichtig. Dann sind wir uns ja einig. Nein, Ziggy, da sind wir eben nicht. Actually, I see that everyone's busy finishing the event, so I can confiscate the leftover pizza for myself. Mine. And that's the point. Same table, same people, same event. Freud sees unconscious sexual conflict. Jung sees symbolism, myth, transformation, perhaps something beyond the immediate personal drama. And I see unattended pizza. The pizza is real. So are the interpretations. But none of them, by themselves, are the whole picture. Now, again, I don't want to make the lazy argument that Freud was simply an idiot who thought everything was about sex. Sexuality really is psychologically important. Desire really does influence us. Repression exists. Most people really do have motives they don't fully understand. Freud's great achievement was forcing psychology to take those hidden dimensions of human life seriously. And as Jung himself later acknowledged, Freud gave us an extraordinary tool for investigating the unconscious. But a tool isn't the entire landscape. The problem comes when one explanatory principle becomes a master key. Suddenly, the dream isn't merely a dream. The object isn't merely an object. The myth isn't merely a myth. Everything becomes evidence for the same underlying mechanism. If you look for a phallus behind every lamppost, congratulations, you've just invented a world in which lampposts are phalluses. And if you start seeing phalluses everywhere, well, that's a fallacy. And this is precisely the Zeitpunkt where Jung becomes interesting. Jung didn't reject sexuality. He explicitly argued that sexuality was enormously important. What he rejected was the idea that sexuality could serve as the ultimate explanation of psychic life. For Jung, symbols could point beyond their immediate biological or personal meaning. A myth could be sexual, but also religious. A dream could express a personal conflict, but also something about the development of the personality. And this introduces a question Freud's framework struggles to accommodate. What if the psyche isn't merely trying to discharge something? What if it's also trying to become something? This distinction matters. Freud essentially looks backward. He asks, what produced this? Jung looks inward and forward. He asks, what does this mean? And where might it be leading? Freud was extraordinarily interested in the first question. Jung increasingly became interested in the second. And neither necessarily invalidates the other. And perhaps the clearest example of this is what eventually happened between Freud and Jung. Jung didn't reject the unconscious. He didn't reject repression, and he certainly didn't reject sexuality. What he did reject was the idea that only these things could explain the psyche in its entirety. And eventually, that disagreement became impossible to separate from their relationship. Jung had learned from Freud how powerful an interpretive framework could be, but he also came to realize that a framework can become a limitation when you no longer see beyond it. In a rather strange way, Jung's break with Freud became an example of the very thing he was arguing for. The explanation isn't necessarily the end of the story. This is why I like the metaphor of the glasses. If you put on rose-colored glasses, you really do see pink. The pink isn't imaginary. Your glasses are genuinely revealing something about the way light reaches your eyes. But that doesn't mean you've discovered that the world itself is pink. You've discovered what the world looks like through those glasses. And that's the distinction I think we need to preserve with Freud. Freud gave us a lens, but he didn't reveal the whole landscape. Perhaps the lesson isn't to throw away the glasses, it's to remember that we're wearing them, and sometimes to try on another pair.